Welcome to the podcast Heja Framtiden, a podcast and platform about the future. My name is Christian von Essen. I'm recording here today from Stockholmsmässan, a trade fair in Stockholm at Gastronord and the Food Tech conference, a big meet. I'm sitting here now with Louisa Burwood-Taylor from something called Agfunder. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Head of News and Research, is that correct, at Agfunder. Can you tell us a bit about Agfunder, what it is, what you do?
Yes, Agfunder has been around for about 10 years now. We are a venture capital and research platform focused on the global food and agriculture industry. We have funds of around $300 million in size, and we have a subscriber base of nearly 100,000 people globally that read our weekly newsletter based off of our news site, agfundernews.com. And we also do research reports around funding levels in and around food and agriculture.
And you just spoke to Sweden Food Tech's Johan Jörgensen here on stage about the sort of trajectory of ag tech and food tech investments, basically. And we saw a very high peak in 2021, and after that you said it has been a bit disappointing. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, so we've had a steep decline since the heydays of 2021, which was actually a boom year for all venture capital investment, but also in Agrifoodtech, and investment reached around $50 billion. Last year it tanked over half. And it's now also reduced. The proportion of all venture capital that goes to Agrifoodtech is now only 5.5% versus 7 to 8% in the years previously. And when you look at the contribution of the industry to climate change, it's 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. To global GDP, it's up to 20% for all food and agriculture, and it employs over half the workforce. So it's just mad that it's such a small portion of all investment.
And what do you think is the reason for this? I mean, obviously the bubble in 2021, if you call it a bubble, it was driven in large part by the COVID pandemic. There was a lot of talk about ghost kitchens, delivery services, online retail, etc., which is not as interesting at the moment. But also the alternative protein sector and the vegetarian sector has declined. Do you think there was a lot of mediocre products being pushed out too soon?
Yeah, so I think it was a combination of there being mediocre products, but also a lot of hype and overexcitement. And we had a lot of investors from outside of the industry coming in and pushing up the valuations of a lot of these companies. Similarly, it happened in the indoor agriculture vertical farming space too. I don't like to use the word dumb money because that's quite rude, but it is that sort of concept of the sheep herd mentality of investors. And a lot of that took place, I think, in alternative protein and vertical farming. The point is that now, you are seeing some products are starting to get a bit better, but consumers were just not ready for it or not excited. They're not willing to sacrifice taste, and they're not willing to pay more for these products. And I think that was something that was misunderstood in the early days.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the generalists or the general investors had basically pulled out of the sector, but we still see a slight increase in the number of funds, right?
Yes, so there's dedicated agri-food funds. There's around 280 of them globally today. But they have increased incrementally over time, but not at all at the pace of the increase in investment across agri-food tech. It'd be great to see more funds dedicated to the space because that shores up that potential funding avenues for a lot of these startups and doesn't rely on these generalist investors. Hopefully we'll see more general investors coming in. The concern is that some of them will have been burned on these investments in alt protein and vertical farming, where we're seeing a lot of companies are closing down. One of the main takeaways, I think, has been the lack of exits, the lack of acquisitions of startups by large corporations, or the lack of public listings so that the VCs can show their investors the returns. Hopefully this year we will see a few more of those. And I do think it is a great time to be investing because valuations are incredibly low right now, almost too low in many instances.
And which sectors do you think are most interesting to or open for investments now?
I always find this a difficult question because I think they're all great, and it also all depends on the founding team and the company approach. But one of the themes that we've been discussing quite a bit here at the Big Meet has been the intersection of food and health. I think it's really exciting. I think nutrition science is so little understood, and with the use of AI and machine learning to help with experimentation, scientific discoveries, I think we're going to understand that link between food and health a lot more, and the way the products that can be produced from that, whether those are actual food products or whether those are medicinal type products as well. It's really exciting.
I sort of get the feeling that more companies are focusing increasingly on the B2B market as a producer of an ingredient or a process or a technology, instead of trying to go to market with a consumer product. Do you think that is sort of a way of balancing the field now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point, because in the early days, I remember we had an alternative protein funder, Agfunder, and a lot of times we really wanted it to be a B2C, a consumer-facing company, because obviously you can pick up a lot more of a margin if that's the case. However, B2B businesses have been attracting a bit more interest from investors because they can obviously feed into the supply chains of the large corporations. It's a lot less sexy, but I think, we were talking about it on stage yesterday with a chef, and he was saying how a lot of these interesting innovations that he is using in his kitchen are things that no one really knows about, but they are useful, whether that's like a vegan egg white replacement or something. It might not have a brand to it and the consumer might not know what it is, but they are finding them useful in the kitchen. So no, I think that's a fair assumption, but I think people are all innovators and founders are always going to try to have a consumer product in many cases to try and capture that value.
Do you think investors in this field need a bit more risk appetite and a longer investment horizon in a way?
Yeah, I mean, that time horizon thing has been a question mark, especially on the sort of ag tech side of things as well, where you have limited growing seasons per year, so being able to iterate on your product is very slow in comparison to sort of software for consumers. And it's interesting that conversation is now coming into food as well. I think, there's place for different types of capital in a startup's life. We do see, particularly in sort of more emerging markets, the use of grant funding, local bank financing as well. And so I'm interested to see how this kind of concept of blended finance is going to come and be used more in the food industry. It's something that I think VCs are not necessarily always sort of comfortable with or willing to embrace because they want to see the sort of scale that comes with VC and the speed of that. But yes, I think that might be the case.
Yeah, it seems like a bit more fragmented cap table now where you pick and choose different sort of capital to serve your business in a more sustainable way.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly, and for different purposes. If you're building a big factory, you probably don't want to be giving up equity for that size of a financing.
And you mentioned large corporations buying up startups. We also see an increase here in Sweden, at least, with CVCs, corporate venture capitalists going into startups. Do you think that's an interesting development, or is it a risk of locking in companies to a specific actor instead of broadening the market?
Yeah, we've had quite a few corporate venture investors in the space over the years, and that has always been, a concern for some of them. I've only seen a couple of instances where that corporation's involvement has been a negative. Typically, they sort of almost promise to be hands-off as much as possible or not try to strategically direct the company. But it's always a risk, and I just don't think you can say one way or the other. It probably depends on the corporation. It probably depends on that individual who's in the CVC team, and it depends on what their KPIs are around it. Oftentimes they say to me, VC returns is the goal, but that can't be the case. It must be strategic alignment, and they must be looking at these companies as potential acquisition targets or partners or ways to, or even companies they could mimic and try to copy and develop those products sort of internally. So I think it really just depends. But the good thing about CVCs is that they do not have a specific time frame and a specific time horizon. And of course they have amazing networks and supply chains in which these companies can test their products and go to market. So I think that it's generally a positive trend.
Yeah, sometimes maybe the only need one particular part of the technology to implement in their own systems.
Yeah.
I usually ask my guests, what is your best tip for making the world a better place in the future?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, if I knew that, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. I think be kind. I think be kind and leave your ego at home. I think big egos have a lot to answer for.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Do you have a podcast tip or a reading tip?
I'm not a massive podcast listener, and probably a lot of people have said this one, but I do quite like the All In podcast, which is with those venture capital heavyweights in the US. It's quite a fun way of getting up to date with the with general news, but from the angle of those investors. So I do quite enjoy that one.
Who do you think I should interview?
Bill Gates, Elon Musk.
Wow, and you. Speaking of be kind.
I know, I'm joking, but I'm just thinking about who I would want to interview on my podcast.
Do you still run your podcast?
No, my podcast is not going at the moment. I'm thinking about launching a new one. So if anyone has any ideas of new and interesting themes, please let me know.
But in conclusion, can we decide that this sector is undervalued at the moment? It needs more capital, more investors, more funding for us to really solve these problems at scale.
100%. We are currently in a climate and a health crisis, and both of these are inextricably linked with the food and agriculture industry, and I think people really need to wake up and realize that.
Thank you so much, Louisa Burwood-Taylor from Agfunder, for joining here Framtiden.
Great, thank you for having me.
We're recording here from Big Meet, the food tech conference hosted by Sweden Food Tech at Gastronord, the big restaurant fair in Stockholm, Älvsjö. My name is Christian von Essen. Check out hejaframtiden.se for more information about the podcast and my other projects. And
agfundernews.com.
agfundernews.com for more information about this whole ecosystem. Thank you so much for listening.